Okay, we'll get started on this part of our discussion. We've already started to talk about a lot of the parameters and how hard it is to measure not only fiscal stress, but social stress. And what my job here is today is to give you some of the sort of realistic constraints that a lot of you are going to face in New York by looking at actually some of the demographic data that we've talked about as being so important. So I'm going to do only a little bit of the demographic data, and that's in employment, and a little bit about wages, and talk to you about some of the concerns and some of the issues that fall in that so that we can have a little bit more of a perspective as we go along today. First, I have to, under full disclosure, let you know that I am the governor's appointee to the Buffalo Fiscal Stability Authority, otherwise known as the Control Board. So we're the bad people that tell you nobody can spend any money. Although what I want to say to you all is that one of the rules that we have and that we tell almost everybody when they come before us is that we can fix all of the fiscal problems in the city of Buffalo. We just won't spend any money. But that's not really the goal of the control board in the city of Buffalo. The goal of the control board in the city of Buffalo is to provide high quality services that will allow the city to grow in a reasonable way. That's very different from talking about a control board that's meant to cut services and do everything else. The other thing that the control board in Buffalo has as a mission is that we will not succeed until every union has a contract going forward, that we fully funded our benefit packages, and there's a balanced budget. Now that's a much harder goal than just getting your fiscal policies under control. And the reason we say that is because we have to realize, even though I'm going to use lots and lots of graphs and numbers, which means we forget about it, it's that we're dealing with real people, with real lives, with children that need education to be able to succeed, to have safe roads so people don't get hurt. There's a lot more to this than I think even the discussions that we're going to have here today, and that we need to keep those in mind as we start to talk about those. So let me talk about what we're facing and where we're going and how we've come out of the Great Recession. Most people don't realize that New York actually started our recession later than the rest of the country in June of 2008, and we came out of it in a faster fashion than the rest of the country. And in fact, since the beginning of the recession, we've created about 230, 240,000 jobs, a little bit more. I'm looking back at June so that we have the last numbers before they've done revisions and other things to them so that we have a baseline to look at. If we want to look at New York, and if we listen to people talk about New York, you know, there's this great success in New York. We've grown 2.5% in our jobs. We've grown 6% since the bottom of the recession. Things in New York must be great. But it really does mask a number of very important and a number of critical issues. And the reality is that, in fact, there's more than one New York. And that New York actually is broken down into a number of regions. And we see this particularly in upstate. When I talk to my New York City friends, they always believe that we talk about New York City and then everybody else. The reality is that that's going to be very dangerous if we want to talk about economic development that's going to be successful, and we're going to work that. In fact, the data does a couple of things. It shows essentially in upstate New York that there are three different kinds of regions that are growing. They're going to need different solutions, and we're going to have to talk about different issues in each of the regions if we're going to be successful. So that means if we're going to look at our fiscal and social stress indicators, we're going to have to be mindful of these different groups, and we're going to have to look and see what kinds of solutions work in different parts of the community. But before we talk about those regions, I want to talk about something a little bit more critical. If we go back to the 2001 recession, and most people don't, I always find it amazing, nothing happened before 2007, so we never draw anything, and nothing before 2007 ever actually impacts anything going forward. The reality in New York State is that we were hurt much more. If you look, the blue line is New York State, the red line is the United States. We were hurt much more in the 2001 recession than the rest of the nation. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but when we put this up in a graph, what you can see is we catch up at the bottom of the second recession and we start to grow a little bit, but what does that mean? That doesn't mean that we're doing better, we should be rah-rahing about how great New York is doing. We're catching up. We're catching back up to the rest of the country. So the reality is that while people want to talk about the success and the growth in employment in this recession, it really masks the fact that we're still trying to catch up to where we should be if we didn't grow slower from the last recession. And the other thing that comes out of this table that I think, or this graph I think is important, is notice that we follow the same pattern as the rest of the nation. And that's going to be an important thing to talk about, is that we're not a part of the nation. Over and over again, as we look at our economic data, New York follows the same pattern. And that's true of almost all in every other state. It doesn't matter whether it's Texas or California or New York or Kansas. The reality is that the economic conditions of the nation have a large impact on what we can do in the state. And that becomes another important point. We have to be realistic. These are constraints that we're going to see, and because we're going to see these constraints, we can't overpromise what we're going to be able to do. If we do that, we get ourselves into trouble. If we forget that these economic conditions are things above and beyond the control of a mayor, or a county executive, or a state legislator, or a governor, and we start to tell folks that we're going to be able to solve all their problems, we're going to end up putting ourselves into a bad position and then make bad decisions because we feel like we've promised things that we can't deliver on. So part of the indicators model is not only to talk about where can we do better, but also to put some realistic bounds around what we think we can do. Now I know this is too small and you have this, you can get a copy of all of these slides and they're going to be up, but the reality is what you want to look here is that in fact, other than Long Island and New York City, and to a little bit of an extent because Cornell's in Ithaca, those are the three areas since last June that have seen any job growth at all. So we still haven't recovered back to where we were in 2007. And I think it's important to look at the numbers and the sides of the numbers. And what becomes really important here is that there are in fact three different areas if we look at them a little bit. First is New York City and Long Island, which are growing faster than both the state and the nation, and are the reason New York State grows faster than the nation. There's Albany, Buffalo, and Rochester, which can be put together into a group. And these groups have not recovered, but at least their trajectory is in an upward motion, and they're essentially going to catch up fairly soon to where they were in 2001. So that's the other thing, is that we're talking about not catching up from the last recession, we're talking about catching up from the recession before that we haven't fully recovered from that yet. But we're moving in the right direction in those three areas. And then Binghamton, Elmira, Syracuse, and Utica a little bit less, but Binghamton, Elmira, and Syracuse, the center part of the state, is not only not catching up to its 2001 highs, it's continuing to decline. So we have, and then other groups and smaller groups fall into this area. The reality is that the data isn't actually very good when we start to talk about giving information to everybody, because the federal government collects our data, whether it's BLS or BEA, and their real goal is to have something so they can compare at the national level. They want to talk about one level down, so they collect data at the state level. They have to do a little bit at the county and metro area, but the reality is that we don't have as good a data set as any of us would like to be able to really help you. So we're trying to pull this together, and to be quite frank with you, I haven't seen anybody try to put together the data here in metro areas. What you see in the press and everything is they'll go and they'll pick out their city or their area, and they'll never talk about what anything else is happening anywhere else to make any kind of comparisons. And if there's something to be said about looking at the data that we're seeing here, it's that you need to be able to compare yourself to other groups of metro areas and counties and things and see how they're doing relative to what you're doing, not to try to compare yourself to an abstract that is some pie-in-the-sky goal or something that people believe we should be able to do, but to look at realistic goals. So what do we see? Here's New York State that we've talked about. You can see New York City is that light blue line. It's growing. Long Island is actually doing better. But here's the point about New York City. They were much worse hurt, which isn't a sentence, but they were hurt a lot more than the rest of the country was in the 2001 recession. And essentially, they're still catching up. They're growing, but they're starting now, as we're starting to see the newest data come in, starting to slow down. And we want to talk about how this employment numbers work a little bit. Here's the Buffalo data that we talked about. You can start to see that the United States is the red line, that even Albany, which is the green line, is really just mirroring the rest of the country, and they're back past their 2008 level. But we forget that that was 10 years of $2 billion in nanotechnology money and other monies. And I would hate to tell you what my good friends at the University of Albany think of that project and how they believe that they've been harmed as a university because of all the money that's been drained out of the university to be able to do that. So that was a huge commitment of state funds that allowed us to grow. That's going to be important later on as we start to talk about what we can and can't do. And then finally, here are the numbers in graphics form that we talked about with Binghamton, Elmira, Syracuse, and Utica. And you can see that they're all declining and they're going in the wrong direction. Although if we looked at 2004 and 5, we would have started to be a little bit hopeful, but the next recession came and they haven't recovered at all. Well, why is this and what's going on? Well, first, when we particularly look at the areas that were most hit, what's noticeable is that the government sector collapsed. That a lot of this job loss is not only state and local jobs being lost, but also federal jobs being lost, particularly in Binghamton. So that as we start to look at job loss, we see that the next area is manufacturing, and then the third area is finance. An area that we don't normally talk about is losing jobs, but those are the three areas where we see the most job loss in New York State, and in actually all of the regions. Manufacturing only grew in Albany. The areas that we're growing in that we see this 230,000 job net growth is healthcare and education and leisure and hospitality. And the strange way that BEA does its education, when we're talking about education here, these are not teachers in the public sector, these are teachers in the private sector, because we count teachers in the public sector as public local employees. So just so that we see when we talk about education, I want to make sure we understand that. And you can start to see that what's going on here is, even though we see employment going up, we're seeing a shift away from high-paying jobs that have good benefit packages to lower-paying jobs with little or no benefit packages. That's a demographic area that, while I know people talk about, we have the numbers now to back up and to talk about that. What do we see from a statewide position? Where are we here? And this is just the regions that we're seeing. And you can start to see, and I think the most important thing is look at that we're losing manufacturing jobs. That's the red one in the middle at a much higher rate than the nation. And we're garnering hospitality and leisure jobs at a much faster rate than the nation as a whole. And in government, what we're looking at is that we're losing jobs faster than the rest of the country. So that when we talk about consolidation, when we talk about services, I think it's important to realize that, in fact, government, we're cutting a lot of government jobs. We've cut a lot of government jobs. They've become now part of the problem and the drag on the economy, not necessarily the best part of looking at the economy here. And we're going to keep on going. So we can see that this is true, and this is for New York City. And the interesting part about New York City is New York City lost more manufacturing jobs than all the rest of the state. There's only one issue about New York City. Manufacturing is only about 1.5% at the start of the recession, and it drops to 1.2% of their economies. So while they lost the most manufacturing jobs, it didn't have very big impact on their total picture. So we need to be careful about looking at that. Whereas when we talk about Binghamton and other groups like here, and here's Binghamton, you can start to see the big orange line that goes all the way to the bottom, is Binghamton's actually losing manufacturing jobs at about a 30% rate. The only problem is that Binghamton shrinks, the size of manufacturing is still larger than the rest of the nation. And I think here's a key critical thing that we need to realize. Manufacturing, while it's important, is also a problem. The problem with Binghamton isn't that Binghamton isn't doing good. The problem is that the nation is in a manufacturing depression. It continues to be in a manufacturing depression, and Binghamton and Syracuse and Utica are highly developed in manufacturing. So that it's not anything that the local community is doing. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the keys that we have to do to deal with that. And then the other issue that you can see here with Binghamton and other areas is that, in fact, they're not getting the hospitality and leisure jobs that New York City's getting. So that's why they're not growing. I'll let you look at some of these things at your leisure, but they do give you the percentages of what's happened with the percent growth and changes in manufacturing. And this is, I think, one of the most important slides that I can put here today. We're fighting a problem that's already passed. If you want to look, the red line is New York State and the blue line is the United States. And this is the number of state and local positions. If you go back to 1963 and 64, yes, New York State, when Governor Rockefeller was building the SUNY and CUNY systems, when we were building the thruway system, when we were developing a lot of things, had a much higher percentage of their economy in state and local employment. The reality is, by the time we hit the first Governor Como, we are essentially back to the national average. And we've been there since then. So these attacks, there's a reason why people think of New York as having this large government sector. But the reality is that that time, probably the last 30 years' time, that time is over. So that to the extent that we think that the solution is just cutting more government, and what we've seen in this recession is that New York cut a higher percentage, almost twice as much as the rest of the country in their government positions. And we're not seeing the kinds of growth where the highest cuts in government services is where we see the lowest growth and the greatest decline. So there isn't this evidence. While I can't talk about a causal relationship saying that growing government will create a panacea, what I can say is there is no causal relationship between cutting government and seeing employment grow. So that's essentially a fallacy that I think too many people have as we go through all of this. One last thing about some recommendations. The other myth I think we have to break is that NELP is a national organization that works on wages and economic development, and they've just done an interesting study on manufacturing salary, and the reality of the idea that manufacturing are high-paying jobs with good benefits is, again, part of our past. The reality is that as contracts have changed, manufacturing jobs aren't necessarily going to bring in the kinds of good-paying jobs with benefits that we see before. And you can look at this, but essentially what we're seeing now is that manufacturing jobs are below the average compensation in our regions. And I've looked at these numbers for New York State, and that's true as New York State as well. And I think that that's important. The other thing that we need to look at here just very quickly is if we've seen wage gaps from basically 2001 to 2013, in New York State, wages have gone up for those that are at the top end of the scale. Wages have gone down as a large percentage for those at the median and below. And this is not wealth, we're talking about wages here. So we're seeing even wage income having increases in disparities that we're talking about. So what do we need to do, and how do we need to look at that? First, given the information that we have, austerity funding in our local areas, for a number of reasons, doesn't seem to be helping very much. We need to start to talk about the successes, and we can look at that as in Albany and Buffalo, where we're seeing those two economies start to turn around upstate, but they've had large investments by the state government on projects. The second part, though, is that we have to re-examine our industrial strategy. While the governor is investing in a number of these projects, a lot of these projects are in manufacturing. And there's a problem with putting all of our eggs in manufacturing. In fact, if you look at the governor's report that he put out right before the election, talking about all of the projects that he funded over the last 4 years, you'll see fully 67% of those projects are in manufacturing. Given that we have wages that are declining with lower benefit packages, and given that we don't have diversification in other areas. So if there's one recommendation I can give to all of you, it's that we need to expand our vision on how we do economic development. We need to diversify and look into other fields that we can see, and we need to adjust and understand that a number of the jobs that we're going to produce, if we look at the national level, are going to be jobs that are lower paying with less benefits, which is going to put a lot more social stress on our communities. So we have to start to prepare for that now. Thank you.
Thank you. Whoa,
That's okay.
oh my gosh.
It's a
Are you
small.
okay?
But it's not up there yet.
Is it up there yet?
It's still not up there.
So while David's bringing this up, because it has a little trouble, I'll go ahead and get started because I know we're short on time. And what I'm going to talk about is the need for a state partner in terms of local government reform. And here comes our tech guy.
I'll just restart it because it's not showing up on the screen.
Is this a different program?
This is
I
PDF.
put it in a PDF.
Okay.
It was up there earlier, so I think if you just close it,
Close it,
start
start
it over. It's this one here.
Shall we take a question for Fred while we're waiting? Is there a question or comment from the audience for Fred?
I may need to go.
So I was the scary economist?
Duplicate. Here we go. Yeah.
And
And then get it up on the screen.
Yeah. It's also cool.
it's all set?
And to change it, you just click that.
Great, thank you. Okay. I want to move us up about 10,000 feet for a minute and think about this as a global issue. And so the Great Recession, though New York is still suffering, as Fred has shown us, from the original 2001 recession, then we get the double whammy of the Great Recession. But across the advanced industrialized countries of the US and Europe, you see a Great Recession and an austerity response. So it's not unique what we're seeing in New York. And the other thing that's consistent across these OECD countries is that the national and state level have focused more on propping up markets and pretty much left localities to fend for themselves. And when possible, they've passed the fiscal crisis down to the local level. Now, at the local level, we've seen a varied response. And I wrote a paper with a colleague, Judith Clifton, and I'll put a few copies out there if you're interested, on 3 responses we're seeing. And actually, local governments are doing all 3 at the same time. They're hollowing out, cutting services and laying off staff. They're what we call riding the wave, exploring new forms of service delivery to try to, literally surf the wave through this difficult waters. And then they're pushing back and reasserting the role of public service. At the citizen level, we also see a varied response. But what we found so interesting is that in the US, while the citizen is generally acquiescent, or if the citizen gets motivated, it's in the form of the Tea Party, an anti-government pushback. In Europe, the political protest from citizens is about wanting their services moved back. In Spain, they've had the green tide of school teachers hitting the streets in such numbers they show up in a picture like this. And there's a similar white tide of public health workers, doctors and nurses, leaving the hospitals and hitting the streets because austerity cuts to education and health have been so deep that it's not acceptable to the purveyors of public service to continue to be in those kinds of situations. Spain, if you wanted a proof of the point that Fred just made, that austerity policy does not generate growth, Spain is a perfect example of that. They have 24% unemployment as a society in general, and among their youth, it's over half. And what happens when you don't give jobs to your young people? They leave. Look at that population pyramid. Not only are Spaniards not having babies, their young people are leaving, and a society with a population pyramid that looks like that collapses. So let's go to New York. The problem in New York, we've been told, is that our taxes are too high. We know we have slow growth upstate, and we have outmigration of the elderly. The AARP has been on the front page of the newspaper complaining about seniors who don't pay that much school tax because they get STAR, who are exempt from the first $20,000 of income tax for their retirement, that they're leaving because the taxes are too high. And the solution the governor offers is that we should cut taxes, cut aid to local governments, cut education funding, underinvest in infrastructure, and increase tax base to firms. That's what we've been doing. I want you to remember that pyramid in the previous slide. Do you really think your future relies on strategies that undermine the economy for your young people? Because if you do, I think you've got Spain looking at you. So will these approaches promote growth? The research evidence says no, and so we need to think about something else. Now, when we first got this policy proposal of improving local government efficiency, it was a 3-legged stool. We were going to have a property tax cap, we were going to promote increased service sharing on the part of local governments, and we were going to get mandate relief. We got 2 legs of that stool. We got the property tax cap, and we got the property tax freeze with enforced increased service sharing, but mandate relief is the broken leg, and when a stool has a broken leg, what happens? It falls over, and local economic prosperity has fallen off the stool with it. So if we need all 3 reforms for comprehensive relief, we need to think about how we need to reform the tax cap so that we don't just starve the cities and citizens of services. We need to rethink this property tax freeze. The idea was to have a tax circuit breaker for homeowners, And the property tax freeze that we got is requiring new service arrangements which ignore the prior history of sharing. And this particularly hurts upstate New York, which has a long history of very high degrees of service sharing. And we still need mandate relief. New York State shifts more expenditures to the local level than other states, and I'll show you some slides on that later. But first, let's change the frame. Local governments are controlling their expenditures. These numbers are controlled for the GDP price, implicit price deflator for state and local government services, so they're real expenditures for county, city, town, and village. Do you notice something about these lines? They're flat. Let's look at property taxes. Again, county, city, town, and village property tax given in real terms. What do you notice about these lines? They're flat. Property taxes were flat even before the cap. One might argue the cap was not necessary. What happened to mandate relief? This is the third leg of the stool. I'm still looking for it because I'm balancing on these two legs. New York has the highest level of state decentralization of fiscal responsibility of any state in our region. Fully 64 cents on every dollar of state and local expenditure is the responsibility of local government. In education, it's even worse. 83 cents of every education dollar for public education is required to be spent by the local government. There is no state in the country that gives less to education in percentage terms than New York. We are number one in our lowest level of state support. State aid. State aid has fallen in real terms for counties, went up just a little bit for cities, basically flat. No, it's fallen for towns, and it's been a little bit flatter for villages. Okay, but what are we supposed to do? We're the local government, and we're supposed to respond. And so I said there were these three responses we're finding: hollowing out, riding the wave, designing new forms of service delivery. I wanted to talk about shared services for a minute because I work with the International City-County Management Association to track the surveys of local government service delivery reform across the nation. And across the nation, the rates of intermunicipal contracting, shared services, have increased from 16% of all service delivery to 21% between 2007 and 2012. But in New York State, the shared service rates are 27%. So we are a national leader in shared services. Give yourselves a hand. Cautious privatization. The privatization trends, you can see they went from 17 down to 16. Basically, privatization is flat across the nation. And I also track new outsourcing versus insourcing. And we find that those levels are also equal. It's about 11% new contracting out and about 11% contracting back in. So it's a dynamic. That's part of why the lines stay flat on privatization. In terms of designing new forms of service delivery, we'll have panels on that this afternoon. The students have been looking at user fees, impact fees, co-production with citizens. The economic development team has given attention to anchor institutions and land trusts. So we do need to figure out things that we can do, and that's what the afternoon sessions are designed for, is to help generate some creative responses to fiscal stress. But I want to talk a few minutes about the shared services, since that is the second leg of this stool that seems to be so important in terms of reform. I want to just give you a sense of where we are. We had the privilege of being able to collaborate, Professor Sippel and I, with the Conference of Mayors, the Association of Towns, the Association of Counties, and the Council of School Superintendents to do a survey on shared services in 2013. How prescient. We never knew it would be such a hot political topic, and now we actually have data. We asked the officials who responded what they were doing in response to fiscal stress, and you'll see this increased reliance on user fees, and that's why we've given it some attention in our research for this conference, and additional shared service arrangements, and personnel cuts. Those are the three top things that cities are doing. And similar to John's finding with school districts, considering bankruptcy and insolvency as a place that nobody wants to go. Okay, of the 29 services we measured, the sharing rate was 27%, and the highest sharing rates were in public works. We know our highway departments have been doing this for decades. Public safety, same thing. Parks and rec, these showed the highest levels. There's an interesting issue, though, here that we have to ask ourselves. What about cost savings? The assumption is that you're going to get cost savings with shared services, but we find that's only achieved half the time. Why? Well, because cost savings isn't the only goal. A lot of times you go into shared services for improved service quality or for better regional coordination and equity across the region. I've joined with a colleague who likes to read journal articles, and he's read every journal article ever published on shared services from anywhere in the world, and he has found that we often don't find cost savings with cooperation. And one of the reasons is the limited economies of scale, the design and management cost of putting together the agreement, and again, this goal of improved service quality. So let me show you a picture. I know, don't have your eyes glazed over. You all had Econ 101 sometime long ago. But the idea of an economy of scale is that you can travel down that cost curve, and that as you go from one municipality to multiple municipalities working together, you're going to get some kind of reduction in per unit cost. That's only true if you don't have management cost in the design of that agreement. And everybody knows you've got to spend money to save money. You've got to design these agreements. And then the other thing you have to think about is the issue of leveling up. If you're going to bring a couple of municipalities together or school districts together to consolidate, we're all going to want the highest level of service. If your school district offers AP classes and I'm joining up with them, I want AP classes too. So one of the main reasons why you don't see cost savings with consolidation is because you actually get improved professionalization, which is a good thing, I think, and improved service quality for your citizens. But don't assume that cost savings are coming with it. So what we did is we matched these up with Janet Mayo from Comptroller helped us with identifying the service areas where the Comptroller actually tracks cost expenditures by governments. So we were able to match up 13 of the services that we measured sharing levels. We were able to match those up with the expenditure data from the Comptroller's office. And so we ran regression models controlling for population density, and metro status, and found that we had lower cost if you shared for solid waste, roads and highways, police, libraries, sewer, and water. But we did not find lower cost among districts that shared for general government administration, emergency management services, youth recreation, elder services, fire, planning and zoning, or economic development. So again, six services we found sharing, 7 services we didn't. These are the 5 categories that the 29 services we looked at were in, and we asked managers to report, did you achieve cost savings if you shared? And again, you see about 50% of the time they're saying, yeah, we achieved cost savings. The one area where they're saying they achieved cost savings more often was in administrative services. So we thought, okay, that's where we should drill down. That's a place where we should go to see if we can find some things. The administrative support services that we were looking at included tax assessment, energy production, purchase of supplies, health insurance, liability insurance, and information technology. Notice that you have over 70% of respondents saying, yeah, we shared services in this area and we actually saved money. But look how few municipalities actually share services in this area. This is small. The highest one is tax assessment at 39%. So this is the place we should go next. If you're looking for where to go to try to save some money in services to meet this new tax freeze requirement, here the survey and y'all's answers to the survey can give us some idea of where to go. And Sibel Samra, who's in the room, wave your hand, has done a series of case studies on energy purchases, MEGA, and I think Barbara Blanchard might be here, on the Tompkins County Health Insurance Consortium, which is in health insurance, and the Nassau County Information Technology sharing platform. So this was funded by the Municipal Innovation Exchange of the 4 local government associations and the school boards. And again, in looking for places that might be fruitful areas to look for possibilities of cost savings with shared services. We also looked at the factors predicting sharing among municipalities, and what we find is that if you're involved in a social network like a council of governments, you're more likely to share, and that the management challenges of sharing are important to consider. And the last point on this slide I want you to think about for a minute. Because sharing is voluntary, why would I share with a higher cost or higher need neighbor? And so we decided to run regression models controlling for this, and when we looked at heterogeneity by income, race, age, and property tax, we found that there's lower sharing when there's more heterogeneity among municipalities in a county. Let me show you what it looks like on a map, just for income heterogeneity. So the darker background means the more income heterogeneity. So that means you have rich municipalities sitting next to poor municipalities in a county. So Nassau, Suffolk, Orange, Putnam, you know, these are places that have rich municipalities and poor municipalities next to each other. Then the white circle is the level of sharing. Notice there's very little sharing that goes on down on Long Island and in the collar counties of New York City. And that's part of what's driving our results, that you don't share with your poorer neighbors. And then look upstate. Look at those big white circles, particularly out in the western part of the state. People are sharing, local governments are sharing. And where you see low sharing upstate is the Adirondacks and the Catskills. And you know, it actually is harder to share across mountains. Then we did, John Sipple mentioned this morning, the school survey. The school survey measured a whole host of services, 36 maybe, it was a lot. We just, because I'm interested in local government, we just looked down at community services, recreation facilities, preschool health, nutrition. Are you sharing your school facilities with your community? And then we looked at administrative services like payroll, transportation, purchases, health insurance, school resource officers, the kind of back office services that you could share with your community. And we asked, what drives sharing? And here we found that the smaller school districts share more. In the municipal survey, we found the smaller municipalities share less, even though from an economy of scale perspective, you would expect the smaller ones to share more. But because of the management cost of designing and implementing sharing agreements, they don't have the capacity, so they don't share. What do you think explains the difference with schools? Smaller districts share more. They have BOCES. When the state decided that it wanted to promote sharing, it created an institution to handle the design, handle the management, and it even created a governance structure for that institution that gave an equal vote to every school district in that BOCES. And it accompanied it with differential state aid so that sharing with a poorer neighbor is not a negative. And so what you see in the school results is that BOCES works. Anybody here from BOCES? Kudos to you. But the bottom line in this chart is also the concern. Schools with more poor children share less. These are the neighborhoods where children don't have parks. You need to unlock your playgrounds after 3:30 in the afternoon. So, we need an administrative structure to promote more sharing, because this is the design, the finance, the management, and the oversight. Now, what could you do? The state could empower counties to do this. Tompkins County is taking the lead and thinking about how to do this through their Council of Government. You could empower your Council of Government. Or you could expand the BOCES remit to include municipal services. They can already do COSERs, and we've got some issue briefs out there for you on that. We also need state aid to promote sharing with poorer partners. If the state is serious about promoting sharing, there needs to be differential aid to make poorer partners attractive. We also need to do the state rules to limit sharing. There's state rules that limit sharing, which y'all pointed out on the survey. These include restrictions on service sharing between local governments and special districts, particularly fire, not allowed. Contract rules that promote leveling up of cost among partners, and concerns about liability and accountability. So, to conclude, we need a state-level partner because we need mandate relief. I would argue the state should re-centralize more fiscal responsibility upwards because we are one of the most decentralized states in the nation. We need to increase aid to municipalities and school districts. We need to give local governments more flexibility so they can do what they do well, which is innovate. And we need to think about an administrative structure to facilitate sharing. And I'm going to give you one last slide. These are a bunch of donuts. I'm the last speaker before lunch, and we're all hungry, but this is a donut I don't like eating. It shows a donut hole of poverty in all of our upstate cities, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, surrounded by a donut of wealth. We do need regional approaches because we need to figure out how to have resource sharing for the services that all citizens of New York need. And I would argue that equity is a superior growth strategy. Thank you. We can take 5 minutes of questions, so we'll share this mic and you all come to yours.
You're still scared, huh? We don't bite, really.
Comment more than a question. I am one of the people here from the BOCES, and it was interesting to hear someone not at the BOCES talk about the BOCES model and how it works to support the idea of shared services. And as many of you know, the new state property tax freeze, rebate, check, whatever, in year 2 has these government efficiency plan requirements. I realize that guidance on that isn't totally out, but from what we've heard, the state will not allow any district to count any shared services run through BOCES. So it's strange to me that a model that's working is now seems to be, if you're a conspiracy nut, something the state's trying to dismantle.
So the purpose of this conference, and the reason why it's being held in December and not January, is that ideas like that ought to be easy fixes in the next legislative session. You have a model that works, allow it to continue to work. If the goal is to promote more sharing, which I think is not a bad idea, then allow the mechanisms that already work well to continue to work and to count. Sharing between schools and municipalities should count. Sharing with BOCES should count. Historical sharing should count. And you all should be singing that tune to your legislatures and getting them to change the law. The legislators vote for the law. They should be changing it. Because if we really are serious about promoting sharing, let's promote it. And we know how to do that. We've done it.
One other thing on sharing is looking at the employment data, you can start to see that the sharing that we really want to see is from the areas that are doing better, the Buffaloes, Albany, Rochesters, in upstate in the New York City and Long Island areas, to the center part of the state. The only way to really do that is, as Mildred has talked about, is to share, but to share upward so that we're redistributing in a way that becomes fair. Because the reality is, if we can't solve the problems in the center part of the state, the rest of the state is going to fall by the wayside too. So it's in everybody's best interest to be able to come up with and fix the stool and be able to give the resources in areas like Binghamton and Syracuse that need it dramatically.
Hey, Peter Appleby, New York State United Teachers. Fred, I had a question about the good charts you had going back to 2001 around employment levels. Have you looked further back than that to the recession of the early 1990s? Anecdotally, I've heard that it was a real break point for upstate in terms of manufacturing jobs. It was more of it wasn't a business cycle recession. It was more of a systemic restructuring recession. Have you looked back that far and see what it looks like?
You know, I have, and the reality is that manufacturing has been declining for a long time, not just in upstate New York, but everywhere. A lot of that manufacturing decline was in autos. The one good news that we have about autos in New York is that, in fact, we were lucky in both Rochester and Buffalo, and you're starting to see this in these numbers, that they had the auto plants redone right before the recession, so they became the most efficient places to produce so that those areas didn't lose as many jobs. But on the other hand, that means, are we going to be lucky again? And when you look at Syracuse and Binghamton, they weren't lucky with their renovations of their plant and equipment. The other quiet area that we look at, going back from the 90s, that was a dramatic break point for upstate New York, and it's not talked about very much, is defense work. That part of the reason Buffalo and Rochester and Long Island are still doing well is because they still have a large amount of black box, not talked about defense contracts that keep employment high. If we go back to the 1990s, the Clinton administration really devastated New York in a lot of ways by cutting that budget dramatically, and New York saw a disproportionate share of cut in employment in those kinds of manufacturing jobs, and we're starting to get some of those back.
Shall we eat? Was there one more comment from John? Are you going to say something? No, but let this be the last one so we can continue the discussion.
Okay.
Just a real quick point on the BOCES. And first, I'm a huge supporter of BOCES in terms of what the services they provide, and they're the lifeline for many, many small and poor districts. Part of the reason the state, and this is not an argument against BOCES, it's just a point of information, part of the reason the state has a trouble with this is for every BOCES service shared, the state is reimbursing those districts pretty heavily. And so there's a growing cost to the state, even though you're saving money locally, the state's picking up that cost. And in the order of the locality will put down a dime and they'll get 90%, you get 90 cents reimbursement. So I think the answer to that is not to avoid the BOCES like I think the governor is pushing for, but to push for an analysis that would show that the statewide costs are actually reduced, even though you're providing this more shared services, even though the state is pushing back that money out to reimburse the localities. So I think we need to engage, and you and I think we need to engage in some careful analysis around this to really show to the state that there still are savings in the bigger picture, the statewide picture, when these BOCES do their work. Because we see great efficiencies at the local level, great partnerships created, but the state is picking up a lot of that cost.
Appears we have one last comment.
So I'm going to hog the mic now. Just to put a little more meat on that bone that John spoke about, that there is a cost to the state in terms of BOCES aid reimbursing districts for buying BOCES services. A BOCES aid reimbursement range from 36% for the wealthiest districts to 90% for the poorest of districts on approved BOCES expenditures. The biggest component, of course, are salaries, not surprisingly, of those expenditures. The aidable portion of a BOCES salary hasn't been increased since 1990, so it's still $30,000. Back in 1990, that was close to the state average in salary. Now it's about half the state average in salary. So while an aid ratio might say 60 or 70%, the functional aid ratio is more like 35 or 40% because so many costs are unaidable.
Great. Well, the point that I wanted to make here is around the world, when governments want to promote sharing among municipalities or school districts, they create an administrative mechanism to facilitate the management design of such sharing agreements, whatever that administrative mechanism might do. And if you want to promote sharing across difference, which I think we do, you need to think about some kind of aid factor that's going to make it in the interest of the sharing partners to include their poorer neighbor. Those are the two principles. How they actually get designed in policy is for the legislators. But for us right now, our job is to go eat lunch. Thank you very much, and we'll see you back this afternoon.